scratch one flat top. 4 words. Sent over an open radio channel in the middle of the Coral Sea on the morning of May the 7th, 1942. A Japanese aircraft carrier named Shoho was burning from bow to stern. 11 minutes was all it took. American dive bombers found her, and 11 minutes later she was going under. The pilots who did it had flown off 2 American carriers. The man who sent them into that sky had never flown an airplane in his life. His name was Frank Jack Fletcher. Remember that name. Most of you have never heard it. There is a reason for that, and the reason is the whole story. Because 4 months after that morning in the Coral Sea, the United States Navy quietly took Frank Jack Fletcher out of the war he was winning. There was no court-martial, and no charge that anyone ever set down on paper. They simply stopped calling him. Now, 3,000 miles from that burning carrier, in an office at Pearl Harbor, the most powerful naval officer in the Pacific Ocean was sitting at a desk with a pen in his hand. He was writing a private letter. He was writing it to a man who could end any career in the United States Navy with a single signature. Admiral Ernest King, the commander-in-chief of the whole fleet. A man so hard that the officers under him used to say he shaved with a blowtorch. Chester Nimitz was writing to King to stand up for Fletcher, to praise him, to ask that he be promoted and that he be decorated. Nimitz was spending his own name to shield this man. And the record he was shielding was one that no other American admiral in the entire war would ever match. Here is the thing to carry through the next half hour. Chester Nimitz won almost every fight he ever picked to keep Frank Jack Fletcher in the war. He lost one, the last one, and the man who finally beat Chester Nimitz was not sitting in Tokyo. That is what this is really about, not simply why the Navy let Fletcher go, who was strong enough to take him away when the most powerful officer in the Pacific was standing in the doorway with his arms out. Look at what Fletcher was worth first. Then you will understand what it cost to throw him away. Start a long way from any aircraft carrier. Veracruz, Mexico, April of 1914. An American fleet has moved in on the Mexican coast, and the harbor town is full of smoke and gunfire and people trying to get out. Refugees, foreign families, wounded men, all of them crowding toward the water, trying to reach anything that will carry them away from the shooting. There is a young naval officer in that harbor, a lieutenant. He takes command of a refugee ship called the Esperanza, loads her with civilians, and takes her out through the harbor with hostile fire coming down. He does not leave her side until she is clear of the guns, past the rocks, and safe in open water. The next morning he goes back. He takes a train, under a flag of truce, out into country where the rails were believed to be mined, and he brings more people out. For that, the United States gave him the highest award this country can give a sailor, the Medal of Honor. That young lieutenant was Frank Jack Fletcher. 4 years later, in the First World War, he had command of a destroyer, running convoys through waters thick with German submarines and floating mines. For the way he handled that ship and those crossings, the Navy gave him the Navy Cross. So when men later tried to say that Frank Jack Fletcher was timid, that his nerve had failed him, understand what they were saying it about. A man who already wore the 2 highest decorations the Sea Service had to give, both of them earned with the enemy shooting back. His courage was settled long before the Second World War ever began. Come forward now to December of 1941. The Pacific Fleet has been hit at Pearl Harbor, and it is, by any honest measure, broken. The battleships are on the bottom or in the yard. What is left, the thing the bombs happen to miss, is a small handful of aircraft carriers. 3, maybe 4, to cover an entire ocean, and someone has to take them out and fight with them. Chester Nimitz takes over the Pacific Fleet at the end of that month. He needs men he can hand a carrier to and trust to turn the war back the other direction. There are not many. The Navy has spent 20 years arguing over whether the carrier or the battleship is the real weapon, and most of its senior officers came up on battleships with the big guns. Fletcher is one of those. A surface officer, a gunman. He has never earned a pilot's wings. Nimitz hands him a carrier. Understand what those carriers were in the early months of 1942. They were not one weapon among many. They were very nearly the only weapon left. Lose them, and there was not much standing between the Japanese fleet and Hawaii, and beyond Hawaii, the coast of California. Every time Fletcher took his ships out, he was carrying a piece of the country's survival on the decks of 2 or 3 vessels. Nimitz knew it. He handed that weight to a gunman from Iowa, and he did it because he had watched Fletcher work, and he trusted what he had seen. By May of 1942, the Japanese are coming for a place called Port Moresby, on the underside of New Guinea. Take Port Moresby, and Australia itself starts to look reachable. Nimitz sends Fletcher and 2 carriers into the Coral Sea to stop them. What happened there had never happened before in the history of the world. 2 fleets, hunting each other across hundreds of miles of open ocean, and neither one ever laying eyes on the other. No ship fired a gun at another ship. The whole battle was fought by airplanes flying off decks that never came within sight of one another. The first carrier battle ever fought by human beings. And here is what Fletcher did, at the very start of it. He knew he was not an aviator. He knew there were things about launching aircraft, about the timing of a strike, about getting planes back aboard, that a pilot understood in his hands, and he did not. So when a real aviator arrived in his task force, a rear admiral named Aubrey Fitch, a classmate of his who had spent his whole career on flight decks, Fletcher handed him the air battle. He kept the overall command. The big decisions stayed with him. The close work of the carriers, the part Fitch knew in his bones, he gave to Fitch. He gave the controls to the man who could fly them, and kept his own hands on the wheel. The battle itself was a blind, groping thing that ran 2 days. Scout reports came in garbled. Both fleets threw full strikes at the wrong ships. The Japanese sank an American oiler and a destroyer, thinking they had found the carriers. Both admirals were swinging at shadows across an empty sea, each trying to guess where the other man's flight decks were before the other man guessed first. And on the only scoreboard that counted, Fletcher won. His planes sent a Japanese carrier to the bottom. More than that, his airmen left one of the big Japanese fleet carriers with heavy bomb damage and tore the flying squadrons out of another. Neither one could take part in what was coming a month later. The Japanese called off the invasion of Port Moresby and pulled their ships back. It was the first time in the whole war that the Japanese Navy had been turned back anywhere. Hold on to those 2 damaged carriers for a moment, because they matter more than almost anything else in this story. Shokaku and Zuikaku were 2 of the best carriers in the Japanese fleet. Both had struck Pearl Harbor. And because Fletcher's airmen had put them both out of the fight in the Coral Sea, neither one could sail with the Japanese fleet to Midway 4 weeks later. 2 flight decks that should have been there were not there. When the battle that would decide the Pacific came down to a margin of a few carriers, that margin had been set, in part, in the Coral Sea, by the man they would soon be calling timid. That is the ledger. That is what mattered in the long run. It cost him a carrier. The Lexington took torpedoes and bombs, and at first the damage looked survivable. Then gasoline vapor down inside her found a spark, and the fires got away from the crews, and she could not be saved. Most of her men were taken off, nearly 3,000 of them. The ship herself could not be towed home, and the Navy would not leave her for the enemy, so an American destroyer put her under. More than 200 of her men did not come home, and 3,000 miles away in Washington, Ernest King did a piece of arithmetic that he would never undo. Fletcher had lost the Lexington. King would carry that against him for the rest of the man's career, past the victory, past everything that came after, because there was that letter. On the 29th of May, 1942, Chester Nimitz wrote to Ernest King about the Battle of the Coral Sea and about the admiral who had fought it. He wrote this: "Fletcher did a fine job and exercised superior judgment. He is an excellent, seagoing, fighting naval officer." And Nimitz did more than praise him. He recommended Fletcher for promotion to vice admiral. He recommended him for the Distinguished Service Medal. He signed it, and he sent it to the one man in the Navy most inclined to think the worst of Frank Jack Fletcher. The most powerful admiral in the Pacific had put his own name on the line for this man, in writing, over the head of his own boss. If a story like that is worth keeping alive, the like button is the thing that carries it to the next person. That is the whole ask. Then stay with me, because the man Nimitz was defending was about to fight the most important battle of the entire war. June of 1942, Midway. The Japanese are coming again, and this time it is for everything. Nimitz knows they are coming, because his code breakers have told him, and he lays a trap. He needs every carrier he has, and he needs the right men standing on their bridges. The officer who was supposed to command the carrier striking force was William Halsey, the famous one, the fighter. And 10 days before the battle, Halsey is flat on his back in a hospital bed in Hawaii, covered head to foot in a skin condition so bad he cannot sleep. He has lost 20 pounds. He is out. Halsey recommends a cruiser officer named Raymond Spruance to take his task force, a man with about a week of carrier experience to his name. And senior over all of it, the officer in tactical command of the whole engagement, is Frank Jack Fletcher. Nimitz has kept him there. King had his doubts, and said so. Nimitz kept Fletcher. Fletcher's flagship is the Yorktown, the same Yorktown that had come limping home from the Coral Sea with a bomb hole punched down through her decks, torn up, trailing oil across the harbor. The yard at Pearl Harbor looked her over and said 90 days of work. They were given 3. Men worked around the clock, in shifts that never stopped, welding and patching and shoring her up, and in about 72 hours they put that wounded ship back to sea. She could not make full speed. Her power plant was held together by exhausted men and improvised fixes. She sailed into the most important sea battle of the century all the same, because the country needed her deck. On the morning of June the 4th, American dive bombers came down out of the sun onto the Japanese fleet. In about 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were burning. Yorktown's own planes helped finish one of them. 5 minutes. The fleet that had run wild across the Pacific for 6 months. The carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, and in 5 minutes the heart of it was on fire. The men who flew those dive bombers had launched that morning, not knowing if they would find the enemy at all. They found them at the one moment that mattered, with the Japanese decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, and they did not miss. Then the Japanese found the Yorktown. Bombs first, then torpedoes, and the ship the yard had patched in 3 days went dead in the water. Watch what Fletcher did on the bridge of that dying ship. He did not freeze, he did not cling to command for the honor of holding it. His flagship could no longer launch a plane or bring one back aboard, and you cannot run a carrier battle from a deck that cannot fly aircraft. So at 11 minutes past 6 that evening, he had himself carried off the Yorktown and onto a cruiser steaming nearby. And he sent a signal to Raymond Spruance, who still had 2 working carriers and the striking power that would decide the day. 4 words: "We will conform to your movements." He handed the battle to the man who could still fight it. By the time he did that, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers were already finished. The 4th was hit before the day was out and gone by the next morning. Midway was won. Spruance made the hard, correct calls in the hours that followed, and he earned every bit of the credit he got for them. He never once pretended otherwise about what he had been handed. And here is what happened to the other man. Some of the Navy's own histories, written while the war was still going on, told the story of Midway and left Frank Jack Fletcher's name clean out of it. The senior officer at the greatest American naval victory of the war, gone from the record of his own battle before the shooting had even stopped. Nimitz did not leave him out. Nimitz sent him south, to the next fight, with his confidence. August the 7th, 1942, Guadalcanal. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, America is not backing up. The Marines are going ashore on Guadalcanal, on Tulagi, on the little islands scattered around them. It is the first American offensive of the war on the ground, put together out of almost nothing. The men who were there called it Operation Shoestring, because that is what it was. Frank Jack Fletcher, a vice admiral now, commands the whole operation from his carrier, with 3 flat tops under his flag. The transports full of Marines are run by another admiral, Richmond Kelly Turner. The Marines on the beach are led by General Alexander Vandegrift. Before the landing, Fletcher tells them something they do not want to hear. His carriers cannot sit tied to that beachhead for long. 2 days, he says. Vandegrift wants 4. Turner backs the Marines. Fletcher grudgingly stretches to 3. Then the landings run behind schedule, the way landings always do. And on the evening of the 8th of August, with the work only part finished, Fletcher sends the message that will follow him the rest of his life. His fighter squadrons are down from 99 planes to 78 in 2 days of fighting. Japanese torpedo planes are working the area. He recommends pulling the carriers back, and he asks for tankers to be sent forward. His superior approves the withdrawal. Fletcher takes the carriers south. And in the black hours after midnight, the worst night the United States Navy has ever spent at sea comes down on the anchorage. A Japanese cruiser force under a very capable admiral named Gunichi Mikawa slips down the channel between the islands in the dark and falls on the Allied ships guarding the transports. In roughly half an hour, 4 heavy cruisers are gone, and more than 1,000 men with them. It is the worst open-water defeat the American Navy has ever taken. And the story hardened, fast, around one sentence. Fletcher had run. He had taken his carriers and run, and good men had paid for it. Here is what that story leaves out. Fletcher's carriers were more than 100 miles to the south. What happened at Savo Island was a night gunfight, ship against ship, in pitch dark, and carrier airplanes in 1942 could not fly at night. They could not find a target in the dark, and they could not land back aboard in the dark. The machines to do it did not exist yet. Mikawa attacked at night for exactly that reason. He knew that the minute the sun came up, American planes would own that sky and cut his cruisers to pieces. He did his work in the dark, and he was gone before dawn. If every carrier Fletcher had ever commanded had been sitting right off that beach, the planes on their decks still could not have flown a single mission that night. Savo was a catastrophe of the ships that were supposed to be guarding the anchorage. It was not something aircraft 100 miles away could have stopped, and a Marine said so, at the time, right there in the record. A colonel named Melvin Moss, serving on Fletcher's own staff, wrote plainly that the carriers had to be kept fueled and moving, that tying them to the beach was asking to lose them. A Marine officer standing up for the Navy admiral against the Marine generals who would spend years blaming him. 2 weeks after the whole Navy had made up its mind that Frank Jack Fletcher was a coward, he fought his 3rd carrier battle, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, the 24th of August. The Japanese were pushing a reinforcement convoy toward Guadalcanal under the cover of their carriers, and they shoved a light carrier named Ryujo out ahead as bait, hoping the Americans would swing at her and leave the big carriers a clear shot. Fletcher's dive bombers found the Ryujo that afternoon and put her on the bottom that same evening. The Japanese struck back and hit the carrier Enterprise. A bomb reached down deep into her, and men were lost. And the Enterprise crew was so well drilled, her damage control so good, that she was taking her own airplanes back aboard inside of an hour. The Japanese convoy broke off and turned north. The Japanese lost far more aircraft that day than the Americans did, and the air crews they lost were men Japan could not replace. It was an American victory, the third in a row, under the same commander. Now he was not a man without flaws, and this story will not pretend he was. The day before that battle, Fletcher had sent one of his 3 carriers, the Wasp, south to refuel. She was running low, and she had to go. But it meant he went into the fight the next day with 2 carriers instead of 3. A full third of his striking power was over the horizon, taking on fuel when the shooting started. Some have called that a mistake. Others have called it the only choice a man could make with a carrier that was nearly dry, and no firm word yet on where the enemy carriers were. He won the battle short-handed. That is 3 carrier battles. Coral Sea, Midway, the Eastern Solomons. 3 fought, 3 won, and no other American admiral in that war could say the same. 1 week after the 3rd one, they took him out of the war. 1 week after the Ryujo went down, on the last day of August, a Japanese submarine was waiting under a calm, hot sea southeast of Guadalcanal. She put a torpedo into the side of Fletcher's flagship, the carrier Saratoga. The blow flooded a fire room, killed the ship's electric drive, and left her sitting dead in the water. On the bridge, Fletcher was thrown hard against something, and it opened a gash across his forehead. A pharmacist's mate came up and bandaged the admiral by lantern light. 12 men were hurt aboard the Saratoga that day. Not one of them was killed. The flagship was crippled all the same and headed for the repair yard, and the admiral riding her home was a wounded man who had been at sea almost without a break for 9 of the hardest months this country's navy has ever known. The Saratoga was taken under tow and limped back toward Pearl Harbor. Fletcher reached Pearl on the 21st of September and went on his first leave since before the attack on Pearl Harbor. And while he slept in a real bed for the first time in the better part of a year, the decision about his future was already being made. Not by Nimitz, by every enemy he had, all at once. I went looking for the order that ended Frank Jack Fletcher's career at sea, and there is no such order. There is no signed page. There is no memo. A historian named John Lundstrom spent decades inside King's files and King's private papers hunting for a single sheet on which someone had written the words, "Relieve Fletcher," and it is not there. It does not exist. Ernest King was not a man who forgot things. He had earned his own wings late in life, at 48 years old, and he looked down on the surface officers who had come up without them. He distrusted the men who had spent time in the offices in Washington, the men he dismissed as fixers. Fletcher had done a tour in Washington. Fletcher had come up on guns, not on wings. In King's mind, that was 2 strikes against the man before the first shot of the war was ever fired. What exists instead is colder than any order. 9 months of small cuts. It started back in January of 1942, on the very first carrier raid of the war, when Fletcher took his task force into the Japanese-held islands and hit them. He came home having stopped to refuel his destroyers over and over. King, reading the dispatches 3,000 miles away, fired back a message so sharp that one of Fletcher's own cruiser captains read it and called it the stinkingest message he had ever seen. Fletcher read it. He set the paper down. He said 4 words, "I am not perturbed." Here is the part the fuel story usually leaves out. A carrier could steam for weeks without seeing a tanker. Her escorting destroyers could not. They drank fuel fast, and a task force that ran its destroyers dry in the wrong waters was a task force that could lose them. Fletcher kept his ships fueled because a fleet that runs out of oil in front of the enemy does not get a second chance. To King, it looked like a man who flinched. What he was looking at was a man who had decided he would not lose ships the country could not replace. King never let the fuel go. King never acted on Nimitz's recommendation to decorate the man. King had wanted Halsey at Midway, not Fletcher, and after the Eastern Solomons, After a clean victory, King's complaint was that Fletcher had not chased the beaten enemy off into the night, into a gunfight, in the dark. Not one of those cuts was fatal by itself. Every one of them was remembered, and behind the cuts was something bigger than any single man's grudge. The Navy was changing. The aviators, the carrier men, were winning the long argument over who would run the fleet, and they were winning it for a good reason, because the carrier had turned out to be the weapon that decided everything. Fletcher was a gunman in a flying man's war. He was standing in the current the day the current turned. There is one more piece, and it is a quiet one. Right after Midway, Raymond Spruance was pulled off the sea and brought in to sit at Nimitz's elbow as his chief of staff. It lifted him clear of the fight down in the Solomons, the grinder that was chewing up reputations and careers by the month. The men who stayed out there came home marked by it. The man who came into the headquarters came out of it as the second most important admiral in the Pacific. Fletcher stayed in the grinder, and when his crippled ship carried him home, there was, for a while, a plan to bring him back. There is evidence, buried in the dispatches Lundstrom read 60 years later, that Nimitz meant to give Fletcher the Saratoga's task force again, once she was repaired. Then, by the middle of October, William Halsey was healthy. The skin condition had cleared. He was aggressive, he was a flyer, and the South Pacific was crying out for a fighter. Halsey took the whole command, and the plan to bring Fletcher back, if it had ever been firm, simply dissolved. Nobody had to relieve him. They only had to not call. Even Nimitz, in the end, bent. After the Eastern Solomons for the first time, he wrote that the fleet should have used its surface ships more boldly, that the Saratoga should have stood and fought in the dark instead of pulling south. The shield did not shatter. It came down slowly, until there was nothing left of it over Frank Jack Fletcher at all. By November, he had orders to Seattle, and then farther north to the Aleutian Islands. The fog, the cold, a frozen corner of the war where no Japanese carrier would ever come and no great battle would ever be fought. He never commanded an aircraft carrier task force again, not for the rest of the war. Not ever. Here is the account, the way the man himself was too proud to give it. Frank Jack Fletcher commanded American forces in more carrier battles than any other admiral in that war. He lost none of them. In the battles he commanded, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers went to the bottom of the sea. In the first 289 days of the Pacific War, he spent all but 51 of them at sea, most of that time in waters the enemy owned or fought over. No other American admiral came near that number. Now think about who was trying to stop him. The Japanese Navy of 1942 was the best in the world at what it did. It had sunk his Lexington. It had sunk his Yorktown. It had put a torpedo into his flagship Saratoga, with the man himself standing on the bridge. For 9 months, Japan threw everything it had at the decks, flying Frank Jack Fletcher's flag. And it lost every carrier battle he ever fought. Every one. The finest naval air arm on the planet, the one that had caught the United States asleep on a Sunday morning in December, went up against this one American admiral across 3 battles and came away having lost 6 carriers and the irreplaceable men who flew from them, with not a single victory to show for it. That is not luck. Luck does not come up the same way 3 times in a row. The machine inside his own navy could take away his command. It could send his flag off to the fog of Alaska and leave his name out of the histories. It could not reach back and take away what he had already done. 6 enemy carriers on the bottom of the ocean do not float back up because a man in Washington held a grudge. 3 battles won do not turn into losses because nobody returned a phone call. Those things were finished, beyond the reach of any signature. Fletcher retired a full admiral in 1947. In September of 1945, when it was over, he was the senior American officer present at the surrender of the Japanese forces in the northern islands of their own home waters. He stood there and took their surrender. The country he served spent most of the years afterward, when it thought of him at all, remembering him as the admiral who ran. And part of the reason that name stuck to him is that Frank Jack Fletcher would not lift a finger to pull it off. He had lost most of his own records when the Yorktown went down at Midway, and lost more of them when he was carried wounded off the Saratoga. After the war, when the historians came around with their notebooks asking him to sit down and give his side of it, he turned them away. He would not build the story back from memory and risk getting a single fact wrong. He would not write the articles or give the speeches or shine up his own legend. He let other men tell it, and other men told it their way for 50 years. He did not run. He fought 3 times against the strongest navy on earth, and 3 times he won, and the record is still down there for anyone willing to look. A man in Washington could keep him off a flight deck. He could not touch the bottom of the ocean, where the proof still lies. Somewhere in your family there is a fair chance, is a man who wore that uniform in those years, who took his orders from a name the history books left out, who did hard things under a flag on a bridge and never got so much as a paragraph for it. If you know that man's name, put it in the comments below. Not the famous one, the famous names are already safe. The rest of them are only as safe as the people who still remember them. Frank Jack Fletcher won 3 carrier battles in a row, and almost no one ever told you his name. Now you know it. Just after midnight, October 25th, 1944, Surigao Strait, in the Philippines. The water is black. There is no moon worth the name. An 80-foot boat sits low in that darkness, engines idling. It is built of plywood. Its tanks are full of high-octane gasoline, and out of the black ahead, filling the whole horizon, comes the bow of a Japanese battleship. The young American on that plywood deck is not there to sink that ship. He can't. In a few minutes he will fire his torpedoes, and nearly every one of them will miss. 30 miles behind him, in a silent line, wait 6 American battleships, every heavy gun aboard them trained down the throat of that strait. So here is the question worth asking. Why did the United States Navy send the flimsiest thing it owned out in front? First, ahead of the battleships, ahead of everything, because the admiral commanding those battleships was carrying a problem that almost nobody talks about. For 14 hours, he had been blind. He was dangerously low on shells, and the outcome of the last great battle these steel giants would ever fight, the last time they would ever face each other, gun against gun, was about to come down to whether a handful of men in wooden boats could do the one job they were truly sent out to do. It was not to win, it was something else. Tonight, we find out what. Aboard the heavy cruiser Louisville, a stocky, plain-spoken man named Jesse Oldendorf stood in the dark and did the hardest thing a commander is ever asked to do. He waited. Waiting does not come naturally to a fighting commander. Every hour in the dark with no word of the enemy works on a man. But Oldendorf held. He had built something that would only work if he let the enemy come all the way inside it. Spring it too early, and the whole thing was ruined. So he stood on the flag bridge, and he made himself wait. The men who served under him called him Ole. He was 57 years old, an Annapolis man of the class of 1909, and on this night he held in his hands one of the most powerful surface forces afloat. 6 battleships, cruisers on both flanks, nearly 30 destroyers, a wall of steel drawn straight across the northern mouth of Surigao Strait, blocking the door to Leyte Gulf. He had chosen his ground with care. Surigao Strait is a long, narrow funnel of water. A fleet coming up it from the south has nowhere to spread out. It is squeezed into a column, one ship following another, forced to come at you bow first through a doorway barely wide enough to pass. Early that evening, Oldendorf had gathered his fellow admirals aboard the flagship and laid the whole thing out for them. The enemy would have to come to him. Up that funnel, in a line, and he would be waiting across the top of it, every gun turned inward. Whatever advantages the Japanese believed they carried, the strait itself would strip most of them away. Now look down that line of battleships. You are looking at ghosts. 5 of those 6 had been at Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7, 1941. Every one of the 5 had been hit. West Virginia had been torpedoed and had gone down at her moorings in the mud of Battleship Row. California had settled into that same harbor bottom. Tennessee, Maryland, Pennsylvania, every one of them had felt the fire of that Sunday morning. They had been raised, patched, rebuilt, and sent back out to sea. Only the 6th, Mississippi, had missed Pearl Harbor. She had spent that terrible morning far away, on escort duty up near Iceland. Now the 5 that had been left burning were back, and the enemy that had burned them was coming up the strait in the dark to meet them. But here is the trouble Oldendorf had, and it was a bad one. He could not see. The 7th Fleet carried no aircraft trained and equipped to search the water at night. The one night carrier in the whole theater, Independence, had been pulled far to the north hours before, chasing a different Japanese fleet with Admiral Halsey. That single decision carried Oldendorf's eyes in the sky, clean over the horizon, and left him standing in the dark. So he sat there with the mightiest guns in the ocean and no reliable idea where his enemy was. His last confirmed word on the position of the Japanese force had come in around 10 o'clock the previous morning. 14 hours had gone by since then. 14 hours of nothing, and behind him, in the Gulf, lay the reason all of it mattered. Hundreds of ships, the transports and the landing craft that had carried an army to the Philippines, and thousands of men still aboard them. If the Japanese battle fleet broke through the strait in the dark, it would come out into that crowded anchorage like wolves into a pen. Everything Oldendorf did that night, he did with those ships at his back. There was a second weight on him, heavier than the first, and he carried it almost alone. He was running out of ammunition. For days his battleships had been hammering the beaches of Leyte, softening the ground for the soldiers going ashore. That is what these old ships had become: bombardment vessels, floating artillery. Days of that work had run their magazines low, and the heavy armor-piercing shells a man needs to fight another battleship were the ones in shortest supply. Now, with a fresh enemy battle fleet bearing down through the night, Oldendorf did not have the shells to throw away on guesswork. He could not open up blindly and hope. If he wasted his fire, his own giants might be caught short, outgunned by antiques, sunk for the want of shells. To make every round count, he needed to know exactly where the enemy was, exactly when, exactly on what heading. The most powerful admiral on the water that night was blind and low on shells, and the only eyes he had left were the cheapest, thinnest, most fragile thing in his entire command. There is a line Oldendorf gave afterward that tells you the kind of man he was. He had been asked, in so many words, whether it was quite fair to set such a trap for a weaker enemy. His answer had no softness in it at all. He had no intention of giving the other man an even break. So ask yourself, if you were Ole Oldendorf, blind, low on shells, with the lives of thousands riding on your judgment, what would you push out ahead of you into that darkness? The answer the United States Navy had settled on is the strangest part of this whole story. Picture the thing Oldendorf pushed out in front of his fleet. Put your hand on one. A PT boat was a little under 80 feet of plywood, not steel, wood. 2 layers of mahogany planking with a skin of glue and canvas between them. 3 aircraft engines crammed into the hull, and thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline riding right there with the crew. A machine built to be fast and cheap and, if it came to it, easily replaced. A single shell could open one up like a matchbox. A single tracer in the wrong tank could turn one into a torch on the water. The crews knew it. They were young. Some of them were barely out of high school. Ensigns and enlisted boys in soaked dungarees, standing watch on a wooden deck with the sea a few inches below their boots. These were not the glamour boats of the newsreels. A PT boat rode hard and wet and loud. It pounded a man's spine in any kind of sea and soaked him to the bone. It broke down. Its torpedoes were old and cranky, and every man aboard knew not to trust them too far. What the boat had was speed and a low shape in the dark, and a crew young enough to believe it might get away with anything. On a clear night, one of them could run better than 40 knots. In a fight against anything bigger, that speed was the only thing it owned. The Navy had learned what these boats were good for the hard way, across 3 years and 1,000 miles of the Pacific. Not slugging matches, scouting, slipping along dark coastlines and through black straits, watching, reporting, harassing the enemy's night traffic, and radioing back what they saw. By the fall of 1944, more than anything else, the PT boat had become the Navy's set of eyes in the places its big ships did not care to go groping around in the dark. Surigao Strait was exactly such a place. There were 39 of these boats at Surigao Strait that night. They were sorted into 13 little groups of 3 and strung out across the southern approaches like a tripwire, down the throat of the strait and out into the Mindanao Sea beyond, some of them posted clear out near Camiguin Island, far ahead of everything and everyone else. This was not an accident. This was not a slip in the plan. This was the plan. The United States Navy had looked at its own lineup, the battleships, the cruisers, the destroyers, all that steel, and it had deliberately placed the frailest thing it owned out at the very front, closest to the enemy, first in his path, not to trade blows with battleships. They could never do that, but to sit in the dark, on their little wooden decks, on top of their gasoline, and listen for the sound of a steel fleet coming on. The men on the flanks and in the battle line, the destroyer sailors, the cruiser gunners, the giants in the battleships, every one of them was counting on those 39 boats out front. If the boats did not find what was coming, and find it in time, nothing else in the plan would matter at all. Everything that came after depended on the smallest men there doing that one thing. Before the steel comes up that strait, I want to ask one small favor of you, and I mean it plainly. If the men who did this kind of work, the quiet work, the kind no newsreel ever put on a screen, mean something to you, take a second and tap the like button. Not for me. For them, it helps more people find the ones who earned it. Then stay with me, because the steel is almost here. Coming up the strait toward that tripwire was a proud man on an old ship. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura commanded what the Japanese called Force C. At its heart were 2 battleships, Yamashiro and Fuso, sisters, laid down in the years before the First World War, once counted among the largest warships afloat. By 1944, the world had gone past them. They had spent most of the war in home waters, on training duty, one of them ferrying troops. Neither had truly been tested in a great gun battle in her life. With them came the heavy cruiser Mogami and a screen of destroyers. These were not weak ships in the way the plywood boats were weak. Each of the 2 carried a dozen 14-inch guns and armor a foot thick in places. 30 years before, they had been the pride of a rising navy. But they were slow, and they were old, and the kind of war they had been built to fight had died a generation before this one. Now they were being spent on a desperate errand, in the dark, without the support that was supposed to come, and the man who led them knew it. Nishimura's orders were one piece of a larger design. While the main Japanese force came down from the north, his ships would slip up through Surigao Strait in the night and burst into Leyte Gulf at dawn, straight into the soft belly of the American invasion. The transports, the landing ships, the men. It was a plan that needed 2 things above everything: surprise and support. By the evening of October 24th, Nishimura had lost both. It had started that morning. Not long after 9 o'clock, planes from the American carriers had come down out of the sky and worked his force over in the Sulu Sea. A bomb burst on Fuso's stern and swept away her float planes. Another smashed a forward gun turret on the destroyer Shigure. Neither ship was hurt badly enough to fall out, but the meaning was plain as day. The Americans knew he was coming. They knew his strength. They knew his road. There would be no dawn surprise, and then, around 6:30 that evening, a message reached him from the north. The main force, the one that was meant to come charging in beside him and share the killing, had been battered from the air and thrown badly behind schedule. It was not coming, not in time, perhaps not at all. He was going in alone, and here is what he did with that knowledge. Nothing. He did not slow. He did not turn aside. A short while later, another order came down from the very top of the Japanese command, meant for every ship in the operation. All forces would dash to the attack. If Nishimura had wanted a reason to keep going, he had just been handed one. He took it. He held his course, and he held his speed, straight for the strait where 6 American battleships stood waiting in the dark. We cannot climb inside his mind. Nishimura would not live through that night to tell anyone what he was thinking, and it does no honest man any good to pretend otherwise. What we have is what he did, and what he did was keep going. Sometime after his boats first tangled with the Americans in the dark, he sent a signal back to the other Japanese commanders. In it, he reported that he was advancing as scheduled, while destroying the enemy torpedo boats in his path. Sit with that a moment. He believed the little boats were nothing, nuisances, insects to be brushed off his bow while he pressed on toward the real prize. He was sweeping them aside and telling his superiors he was winning. He did not understand what those boats were doing. They were not there to stop him. They could never have stopped him. They were there to mark him, so that the guns waiting in the dark ahead would know exactly where to reach for him. The proud admiral steamed toward those guns, certain he was clearing the road, and 30 miles ahead of him, on a plywood deck, a young man was about to catch him on a radar screen. Out on the tripwire, the waiting had turned strange. A squall was building to the south, and ahead of the rain came something the older hands had seen only a few times in their lives: St. Elmo's fire. The gun barrels and the radio antennas on the wooden boats began to glow and crackle with pale blue light, thin streamers of static climbing off the metal into the dark. Then a flash of lightning lit the water, and on one of the boats a young officer named Terry Chambers saw them. A column of warships, hard black shapes coming on, headed straight up the strait toward the waiting fleet. The time was 36 minutes past 10 on the night of the 24th. On PT-131, an ensign named Peter Gadd was bent over a radar set, a piece of equipment about as dependable as the weather, when the screen bloomed with returns. Big ones, solid, closing. His was the first American contact of the entire battle. The Mosquito had spotted the mountain. 3 boats revved their engines and slid in to attack. But the Japanese were awake. The destroyer Shigure, a hard, lucky ship that had lived through night after night down in the Solomons, caught sight of them, and the strait came apart. Searchlights snapped on and pinned the little boats against the black water. Star shells burst overhead and turned the night into a sick white daylight. Then the guns. Heavy fire, walking in around wooden hulls with no more protection than a rowboat. One shell struck PT-130. It punched clean through the boat without going off, and it killed the radio stone dead. In that instant, the crew that had the enemy square in front of them had no way to tell a living soul. Another boat, PT-152, took a hit that set her afire, splintered her bow, and cost her a man at his gun. Her skipper hauled her out of the light and away. And it was not only those 3 boats. Farther up the line, section after section took its turn. Another group, led by a young lieutenant named Dwight Owen, came in on the column near midnight and loosed its torpedoes before the searchlights ran the boats off, one of their little 40mm guns shooting out an enemy light as they went. Each section did the same thing in its turn. Come in out of the dark. Fire. Get caught in the light. Take the enemy's fire. Break away behind smoke. And every time, if the radio still lived, send the word back up the line. Now hold on the boat that could not speak. PT-130 had the contact and no radio, so her skipper did the only thing left to him. He drove his shot-up boat across the water to the next group, found PT-127, and passed the word by voice, the position, the course, the size of the thing that was coming. PT-127 got it onto the air. From there it went to the little tender Watchaprig, and from the tender it climbed the chain, up and up, until it reached the flagship. Aboard Louisville, Jesse Oldendorf received it at 26 minutes past midnight. That message, handed off in the dark from a wounded boat to another boat, to a tender, to a cruiser, was the first solid word he had gotten on his enemy's position in 14 hours. His eyes had just opened. And now you can see the answer beginning to form. The Navy sent its weakest ships out first because they were the eyes. And in that moment, in the searchlights and the star shells, on a burning stretch of black water, the eyes had found the enemy and passed him back. They had not sunk anything. That was never the assignment. Against Nishimura's battleships, the wooden boats hit nothing at all. They found him. They held him. They told. The whole elegant trap, the destroyers, the cruisers, the 6 battleships and their patient guns, all of it hung on a thread that thin. A young man in a plywood boat, radio shot dead, racing through gunfire to hand his contact to the next boat over. That is how close it ran. That is how much this Navy was willing to trust to its smallest men. Now Oldendorf had what he needed, and the machine he had built began to close. He had laid it out in layers, and each layer had a job. The PT boats were the eyes. Behind them waited the destroyers, coiled on both flanks with their torpedoes. Behind the destroyers, the cruisers. And behind everything, drawn across the top of the strait, the battle line. The wall he would swing shut across the enemy's road. The destroyers went in first. Captain Jesse Coward knew exactly what the Japanese could do in the dark. He had fought them at night down in the Solomons, and he had seen what their long torpedoes could do to a man's ship. He had no intention of being on the wrong end of that again. His destroyers slid down the flanks of the strait, held their fire, closed the range until they were nearly on top of the enemy column, and only then loosed their torpedoes. Before the Japanese fully grasped they were there. Then they swung hard away and ran for their own smoke. Behind Coward came more. Destroyer attacks off the right flank, then the left, one squadron after another sliding in to fling their torpedoes and slide back out, worrying the Japanese column from both sides at once, wearing it down before it ever reached the guns. And still the Japanese came on, past the wooden boats, through the destroyers' torpedoes, into the range of the cruiser line, 8 ships, American and Australian, that opened up now with a fast, hammering fire, one more layer of the trap folding shut. By the time Nishimura's flagship neared the head of the strait, she had been shot at by very nearly everything the 7th Fleet owned. Everything except the biggest guns of all. Those were still waiting. Fuso was struck. Torpedoes tore into the old battleship and left her crippled and slowing, falling out of the fight. She did not blow apart in some great burst of fire. She took her wounds, dropped out of line, burned, and in her own time she went down. One of the 2 Japanese battleships was finished, and the American battle line had not yet fired a single shot. That left Yamashiro, Nishimura's flagship, pressing on up the strait, straight into the top of the trap. What happened next had a name that any old sailor would know. Crossing the T. The enemy comes on in a column, able to answer with only his forward guns, while your line sits square across the head of that column and brings every gun you own to bear. It is the oldest dream in naval gunnery, and it almost never happens. It happened that night. For the last time in the history of the world, it happened. No fleet has done it since. And this is where the story turns on a detail most people never hear. You might picture all 6 battleships thundering as one. They did not. Only 3 of them could truly see in that blackness. West Virginia, Tennessee, and California carried the newest fire control radar, sets that could reach out and hold a target in pitch dark and lay the shells right on it. When the order came, those 3 opened up with a precision the Japanese had no answer for. West Virginia alone fired 93 rounds of 16-inch armor-piercing steel. Tennessee sent 69, California 63. The other 3 were nearly blind. Their older radar could barely find the enemy at all. Maryland managed to shoot by watching the splashes of West Virginia's shells and ranging on them, and got off a few dozen rounds that way. Pennsylvania, one of the ships raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor, never found a target the whole night and did not fire a single shot. Look at what that tells you. Even here, among the mightiest guns on the ocean, the thing that decided the fight was not the size of the gun, it was whether you could see. The ships that could see did the work. The ships that could not stood nearly silent in the line. It is the same truth the wooden boats were built on, only now it was written in 16-inch steel. And the 5th Pearl Harbor ship, Mississippi, the one that had missed that Sunday morning, fired exactly 1 salvo into the dark that night. That single salvo was the last time in the history of the world that one battleship would ever fire its great guns at another. An age of war ended in the flash of those guns, and the men firing them did not even know it. This was the reckoning the old ladies had waited 2 years for. The ships pulled from the harbor mud, the ships the enemy had counted as finished, stood across the strait and collected the debt in full. Think of the men at those guns. Some of them had been at Pearl Harbor. Some had stood on burning decks that Sunday morning, or dragged shipmates out of the oil, or felt their ship settle into the mud beneath their feet. Some had spent 2 years listening to people call these old battle wagons relics, good for shelling beaches and not much else. Now the same ships, and in more than a few cases the same men, had the enemy's battle fleet coming straight up the muzzle of every gun they owned. They had waited a long time for this. They did not waste it. Yamashiro drove into that storm of fire with no fire control radar of her own, shooting back at whatever she could see, and she took hit after hit. She burned. At last, she turned to go back down the strait the way she had come. She did not make it. She rolled over and went under in the dark, and Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura stayed with his ship to the end. Behind him, the rest of his force came apart in confusion. Ships that could not find one another in the night ran into each other in the dark. A fleet that had steamed in with such certainty no longer knew where its own vessels were. There was a second Japanese force in the strait that night, a smaller one, trailing some miles behind Nishimura under another admiral, Kiyohide Shima. It came up into the wreckage of the first, into the burning water and the ruin of Nishimura's ships. In the confusion, Shima's own flagship, Nachi, ran headlong into the crippled cruiser Mogami and tore open her steering. Shima took one long look at what was left of the fleet ahead of him, and then he did the only sensible thing any Japanese commander managed in that strait all night. He turned around, and he left. One side had fought as a single machine, every part passing the enemy hand to hand, from a plywood deck all the way up to a 16-inch turret. The other had come in blind, and alone, and proud, and it had been swallowed whole. So we come back to the question we started with. Why did the United States Navy send its weakest ships out first? Because their job was never to sink the enemy. Their job was to see him, to name him, to hold on to him in the dark, and to live long enough to hand him back to the men with the heavy guns. They fired most of their torpedoes that night and hit almost nothing. By the cold count of tonnage sunk, they failed, and they were indispensable anyway. Without their eyes, the blind admiral stays blind. The ammunition runs out on guesswork. The perfect trap never closes. That is a hard thing for a fighting service to believe about itself, that the worth of a man is not measured by what he destroys, that the smallest, cheapest, youngest thing you have can be the thing everything else depends upon, a navy that will trust a 20-year-old in a plywood boat to be the eyes of its most powerful fleet, and will build its whole battle around that trust, is a particular kind of navy. That is the thing worth honoring here. I have read a good many after-action reports over the years, and the ones that stay with me are never about the big guns. They are about the boy in the plywood boat who kept calling in the enemy while the water rose around his knees. Of all the ships that came up Surigao Strait under Nishimura's flag that night, one came back. The destroyer Shigure, battered, scorched, alone, pulled clear of the wreckage and limped away to the west, and 2 days later she reached Brunei Bay. She was the only survivor of Nishimura's force. One ship, carrying the whole story home, a single vessel out of the dark. And behind her, at the bottom of the strait, everything else. There were no cameras down there in that darkness, no reporters riding the wooden boats. Most of the men who did the work that night went home, if they went home at all, and never spoke much of it afterward. They were the ones in the plywood boats, out front, sitting on their gasoline, listening for steel. They were the destroyer men who ran the torpedoes in close and turned back into their own smoke. They were the gunners on the old ships the enemy had left burning at Pearl Harbor, back now, and handed their honor again. They did the work that no movie remembered, and they turned the last great battle of the battleship age. When the sun finally came up over Surigao Strait, the water was quiet, oil on the surface, wreckage, the morning coming on soft and gray over a stretch of sea where a whole fleet had vanished in the night. The wooden boats were still out there in that gray light. Some of them were pulling men from the water now, enemy sailors clinging to wreckage, hauled up over the side of the very boats that had marked their fleet for the guns a few hours before. It was a small thing, but it was the kind of small thing that tells you something about the men who did it. Some of you watching this had a father in the Pacific, or a grandfather. Maybe he sat you down once, late, and told you something, a night, a ship, a name, a moment, that never made it into any book, and never will. If you are carrying a story like that, set it down in the comments below. Tell us his name. Tell us what he told you. The record was never finished. The history books took the big ships and the big admirals, and they missed most of the men. You are part of how those men stay alive.
A little past 9 in the morning. May 7th, 1942. The flight deck of the USS Yorktown, somewhere in the Coral Sea, north of Australia. Rear Admiral Jack Fletcher had a report in his hand that was already an hour old, and he was about to bet everything on it. 93 aircraft, every plane he had, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes, all of it, off the decks of 2 carriers, aimed at a target his own scout plane had radioed in earlier that morning. 2 Japanese carriers, 4 heavy cruisers. That was the report. Fletcher had no way to check it, no way to send someone to look twice. In 1942, an admiral did not have a screen in front of him showing where every ship in the ocean sat. He'd had a young pilot, alone in a cockpit, radioing back what he thought he saw, from an altitude where a warship could look like almost anything. Fletcher believed him. He launched everything. And while those 93 aircraft were already climbing into the sky, a second message came in, a correction. The pilot had made a mistake in his code. What he'd actually found wasn't 2 carriers and 4 cruisers. It was 1 light carrier and a handful of escorts, sitting only 30 miles from where the wrong coordinates had pointed. The strike was already in the air, already committed, already burning fuel toward a target that no longer existed the way Fletcher had been told it did. Here's what almost nobody remembers about this moment. Jack Fletcher had never fought a battle like this one, not a smaller version of it. not something close to it. Nobody had. No admiral on either side of this war, American, British, Japanese, had ever commanded a fleet of aircraft carriers against another fleet of aircraft carriers on open water, where the ships themselves would never come within 100 miles of each other. There was no manual for this, no officer to call and ask what to do, no lessons from the last war, because the last war didn't have this weapon. Fletcher was inventing the rules while he was being tested on them. And on the other side of that same ocean, a Japanese admiral named Takeo Takagi was doing the exact same thing. A submarine officer. A man who'd spent his whole career underwater. Now standing on the deck of a fleet he barely understood, staring into the same fog Fletcher was staring into. Two men. Two navies that had spent decades preparing for war. Neither one had ever done this before. If that kind of moment means something to you, a person who has to act before he's ready, because the moment doesn't wait for anyone to be ready, stay with this one. Hit like before we go further. Not for the channel, for men who had to invent the answer while the question was already shooting at them. Let's go back 3 days, to the morning this started. Frank Jack Fletcher was born on April 29, 1885, in Marshalltown, Iowa. Iowa touches no ocean, no gulf, no bay. It is about as far from blue water as an American town can be. That's where the man who would end up commanding the first carrier versus carrier battle in the history of naval warfare grew up. He went to the Naval Academy. He graduated in 1906, and for the next 36 years, he built a career the old-fashioned way, the way the Navy had built officers for 100 years before him. Guns, steel, ships that fought other ships by pointing something heavy at them and firing. In 1914, as a young lieutenant, Fletcher took part in the American landing at Veracruz, Mexico. He commanded a transport under fire, moved men and supplies ashore under a threat that could have killed him at any moment, and did it with enough composure that the Navy gave him the Medal of Honor. That's worth sitting with for a second. Frank Jack Fletcher had already proven, in 1914, that he could hold his nerve under fire. 28 years before Coral Sea, he had already shown the country what kind of man he was in a crisis. But 1914 was a different war. A war of ships and guns and men standing where you could see them. Between Veracruz and the Second World War, Fletcher's career moved through the ordinary rhythm of a peacetime Navy officer. Sea duty on destroyers and cruisers, staff postings, the slow accumulation of rank that came from doing the job well, year after year, without any particular reason to think the rules of naval warfare were about to change beneath his feet. By 1942, the Navy needed something else entirely. It needed men who could command an entirely new kind of weapon, the aircraft carrier, in an entirely new kind of fight. And here is the part that mattered most. Fletcher had never flown a plane. He wasn't part of naval aviation. He belonged to what officers of that era called the Black Shoe Navy, the surface fleet, the gun club, the world of battleships and cruisers, as opposed to the brown shoe aviators who flew off the decks. He was given command of a carrier task force anyway, not because he had spent years mastering air power, not because anyone thought he was the best qualified man in the Navy to run this kind of war. He was given the job because he was there, because Task Force 17 needed a commander, and the war didn't have the luxury of waiting for the ideal candidate to be trained from scratch. Think about what that actually meant for a man like Fletcher. For 36 years, the Navy had taught him one language: range to target, line of sight, the weight of a shell and the arc it travels before it lands. Every promotion, every command, every decision that built his career had been built on the assumption that you could see your enemy before you fought him. The aircraft carrier broke that assumption completely. A carrier task force doesn't fight the way Fletcher had spent his whole life learning to fight. The ships themselves might never come within 100 miles of each other. The battle happened somewhere in the empty sky between two fleets, carried out by young pilots Fletcher would never meet in person, following orders relayed by radio to men he couldn't see and couldn't correct once they were in the air. He had spent his career learning to command what he could see. Now he was being asked to command what he couldn't. Before Coral Sea, Fletcher had already led carrier task forces in smaller actions, hit-and-run raids against Japanese-held islands in the Marshalls and Gilberts in the opening months of 1942, while the country was still reeling from Pearl Harbor. Those raids taught him something about the mechanics of launching and recovering aircraft, about coordinating a strike, about the rhythm of a carrier at war. They did not teach him what it meant to face another carrier fleet doing the same thing back to him. Nobody's raids had taught anyone that. It had never happened. This is what America did in 1942, over and over, in places nobody would think to look for it. It handed enormous responsibility to ordinary men who happened to be standing in the right place at the wrong time. And then it asked them to figure out the rest, in real time, with lives riding on every guess. Fletcher was one of those men. He would not be the last. By early 1942, Japan controlled almost everything it had set out to take. Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore. The Philippines were falling. The empire that had struck Pearl Harbor 5 months earlier had not lost a single major engagement since. The next target was Port Moresby, on the southern coast of New Guinea. If Japan took it, they would have an airbase close enough to threaten northern Australia directly. The operation was codenamed O. Word had reached the American side that something was coming. Not the exact shape of it, not the location of every ship involved, just enough to know that Japan intended to move against the Coral Sea region sometime in early May. That's an important distinction, and it's worth being precise about it, because it separates what happened here from almost every other intelligence story in this war. Knowing that an operation is coming is not the same as knowing where the enemy actually is. Rear Admiral Fletcher took Task Force 17, the carriers Yorktown and Lexington, along with their escorts, into the Coral Sea to intercept a fleet he could not see, moving through water he could not watch, toward a rendezvous point nobody could mark on a chart with any confidence. On the other side, Vice Admiral Takagi brought his own carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, down from the north to screen the invasion force. Understand what these two commanders were working with. No satellites, no long-range radar reliable enough to trust past a few miles. Radio direction finding that gave rough bearings, not fixed positions. The only real way to find an enemy fleet on the open ocean was to send a plane out. Have a man look down with his own eyes and hope the weather cooperated. The Coral Sea in early May does not cooperate. Low cloud, sudden rain squalls, visibility that could close to almost nothing in the time it took to fly from one patch of ocean to the next. Takagi's carriers swung wide around the eastern edge of the Solomon Islands on their approach, not because he had guessed where the Americans were, but because he was trying to stay clear of Allied land-based bombers flying out of Australia. That single decision put his fleet and Fletcher's fleet close enough, for several days, that either side's scout planes could have stumbled onto the other by pure accident. Neither one did. Two of the largest naval air forces ever assembled were circling each other in the dark, and nobody in either fleet knew it. Picture what that actually looked like from the deck of one of these ships. A scout plane leaves the carrier before dawn, flying a search pattern that covers maybe 200 miles in a wedge shape, straining to see through cloud cover that can drop visibility to almost nothing in minutes. The pilot has no radar of his own worth trusting at any real distance. He has his eyes, a compass, a radio, and a fuel gauge that tells him exactly how long he can stay out before he has to turn back or ditch in open water. If the enemy fleet happens to be under a rain squall when he flies over that patch of ocean, he sees nothing. If his radio garbles a single letter in his position report, the ships hunting for that contact could be searching 200 miles from where the enemy actually sits. This was the entire technology of finding an enemy fleet in 1942. Human eyes, weather, luck. Both commanders were flying blind by design, not by failure. There was no better tool available to either of them. Fletcher couldn't requisition a satellite. Takagi couldn't order up long-range radar that didn't exist yet. They were both working with exactly the same primitive toolkit, in the same unpredictable weather, hunting an enemy who was doing the exact same thing to them. For 4 days, May 3rd through May 6th, both fleets maneuvered through the Coral Sea without either one landing a confirmed sighting of the other's main carrier force. Land-based scouts caught pieces. Submarines reported partial contacts. None of it added up to a clear picture for either side. 4 days of two of the most powerful naval air forces on Earth, stalking each other through fog and guesswork. Each one certain the other was somewhere close, neither one able to prove it. Consider, for a moment, who Takagi actually was. He wasn't a career aviator. He'd spent the early decades of his service commanding submarines, small, slow, quiet vessels built around patience and stealth. Nothing like the speed and violence of carrier warfare. By the time he took command of the carrier force bound for Port Moresby, one source close to the operation would later describe his grasp of air combat in blunt terms: a complete lack of experience in the kind of warfare he'd just been handed. What kept his force functional was his working relationship with Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara, the aviator who actually commanded the striking arm, Shokaku and Zuikaku themselves. Hara knew aircraft. The two men leaned on each other because neither one, alone, had the full picture of what they were now responsible for. Frank Jack Fletcher had no equivalent partnership waiting for him. He had to be his own Hara. Look at the shape of Takagi's career leading up to this moment. He graduated from Japan's Naval Academy in 1911, ranked well inside the top 20 of his class. From there, his path ran almost entirely underwater. Years commanding submarines through the 1920s, torpedo warfare courses, staff postings that had nothing to do with naval aviation. By the time war broke out with the United States, he was commanding a cruiser division, escorting invasion convoys into the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies, winning a clean victory over an Allied squadron at the Battle of the Java Sea in February 1942. He was a capable, experienced officer. He had also never commanded a single aircraft carrier in combat before Coral Sea. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent years building the finest carrier aviation force in the world. Its aircrews were among the best trained in the war. And the man placed in overall command of that striking power for Operation MO was a submarine specialist, handed the job for reasons that likely had far more to do with seniority and available assignments than with any particular mastery of naval air warfare. That is the shape of this story. Two commanders, on opposite sides of a war, both handed a weapon they hadn't spent their careers mastering, both expected to use it as if they had. Neither the United States Navy nor the Imperial Japanese Navy set out to run this experiment this way. It simply worked out that the two men standing at the center of the first carrier battle in history were both, in the truest sense, outsiders to the weapon they were commanding. May 7th, 1942. Before sunrise, Japanese scout planes went up looking for the American carriers. At 7:22, one of them radioed back with what sounded like exactly what Takagi and Hara needed: An American carrier, a cruiser, 3 destroyers, moving north, less than 200 miles away. Hara felt something close to relief. He had believed all along that the American fleet was somewhere south, closer than his own staff estimates suggested. Now here was a report that seemed to confirm it. The enemy was right where he thought they'd be. By 8:15, 78 aircraft were in the air from Shokaku and Zuikaku, flying hard toward the position in the contact report. What those pilots found, when they arrived, was not a carrier. It was the American oiler Neosho and the destroyer Sims, 2 support ships that had been detached from the main fleet days earlier, sitting alone in open water, nowhere near Fletcher's carriers at all. The Japanese pilots didn't know that yet. They attacked what they saw. Sims went down with heavy loss of life. Neosho was left burning and adrift, so badly damaged that her survivors would not be rescued for days. 78 aircraft, an entire strike force, spent on 2 ships that had almost no bearing on the outcome of the battle. Sims went down fast, taking most of her crew with her. Neosho stayed afloat, burning, drifting, her survivors clinging to whatever wreckage they could find, hundreds of miles from anyone who knew where to look for them. It would be 4 days before rescue ships found what was left of her crew. 4 days adrift in open water, not knowing whether anyone even understood they were still out there. 2 ships. A few hundred American sailors who had nothing to do with the fate of Port Moresby. Nothing to do with the strategic outcome either side cared about. Caught in the crossfire of a contact report that was wrong from the moment it left the pilot's mouth. That is what a mistake costs in this kind of war. Not a line in an after-action report. Men in the water, waiting for someone to notice. Hara had been so certain. The report had matched what he expected to find, and it had been wrong in every way that mattered. There's a detail here worth sitting with. Hara had spent the days before this believing, based on his own staff's estimates, that the American fleet was closer to his position than most of his officers thought. When the contact report came in describing exactly that, an enemy force close by, moving in a direction that matched his instincts, it must have felt like confirmation, like the fog had finally cleared and his own judgment had been right all along. He committed his strike force on the strength of that feeling. What he didn't know, and couldn't have known with the tools available to him, was that the actual American carriers were more than 200 miles away from where his search planes were looking. Far enough that his own scouts would never have crossed paths with them that morning, even if the weather had been perfect. Hara wasn't careless. He wasn't a poor commander making an obvious mistake. He read the evidence in front of him exactly the way any competent officer would have read it. And the evidence was wrong. That is the nature of the fog this battle was fought inside. It didn't punish incompetence. It punished the very act of having to decide anything at all with information that hadn't caught up to reality yet. At almost the same hour, on the American side, a scout plane from the Yorktown was flying its own search pattern. The pilot spotted a formation of Japanese ships and radioed back a contact report using the standard coded format of the day. Something went wrong in the translation. What reached Fletcher's staff read as 2 carriers and 4 heavy cruisers. What the pilot had actually seen, once the coding error was later corrected, was the light carrier Shoho, screened by a much smaller group of escorts. Fletcher did not know about the error yet. He had a report in front of him describing the single most important target in the entire operation, the heart of Japan's carrier striking power, sitting within reach of his aircraft. He gave the order. 93 planes left the decks of Lexington and Yorktown within minutes of each other. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes, nearly everything Fletcher had. Then, while that strike force was already climbing and forming up for the flight out, the correction came through. Not 2 carriers, 1 light carrier, a much smaller prize than the one Fletcher believed he was sending his entire air group after, and, as it turned out, sitting only 30 miles from the coordinates his pilots were already flying toward. There was no time to recall 93 aircraft and relaunch a second strike from scratch. What Fletcher's strike leaders could do, once the corrected position reached them by radio, was somewhat smaller and far more demanding. Adjust course in the air, close the last 30 miles toward a target that actually existed, and hope the new information held up better than the first report had. Fletcher had made a decision based on information that turned out to be wrong. He hadn't lost the chance to fix it. He'd lost the chance to be careful about it. Every minute that passed now belonged to pilots making their own judgment calls at the end of a radio link, hundreds of miles from the man who'd sent them. At 11:35 that morning, Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon, leading a squadron of dive bombers from the Lexington, watched the light carrier Shoho go under. He radioed back 4 words that would end up in history books. "Scratch 1 flat top, signed Bob." It read like a triumph. In the footage and the photographs that survive from that morning, it looks like one. Smoke pouring off a sinking ship. American pilots calling in a kill. But look at what actually happened underneath that headline. Fletcher had launched his entire strike force based on a garbled report describing a target twice the size of what was actually there. His pilots had to be redirected in the air, mid-flight, toward a corrected position, trusting a second report to be more accurate than the first had been. The target they found, once they closed that final 30 miles, was smaller than the one they'd been sent after. But it was real. And it was still the first Japanese aircraft carrier lost in the entire war. If the corrected report had come in an hour later, after the planes were already low on fuel and turning for home, the story of that morning would look completely different. If the 2 targets had been 200 miles apart instead of 30, there would have been no redirect at all, just a wasted strike and an empty ocean. Fletcher didn't get to plan for either possibility. He made his call in the fog of the only information he had, sent everything he owned after it, and then trusted the men in the cockpits to close the gap between what he'd been told and what was actually out there. That is not the same story as a brilliant tactician executing a flawless plan. It's the story of a man handling the acid test of command in a war nobody had fought before, the test of what you do when the information in your hand might already be wrong. And you have to act on it anyway, because waiting is its own kind of decision. Stand on that bridge with him for a moment. Fletcher had 93 aircraft in the air, being redirected mid-flight toward a target smaller than the one he'd been told to expect. He had no way to know yet whether that smaller target was still worth the strike, or whether his pilots would even find it before their fuel forced them to turn for home. He had 2 carriers under his command, and both of their air groups were now committed, hours from home, burning fuel over open water, following a corrected position that was itself only as good as the pilot who'd radioed it in. If a Japanese strike found Lexington and Yorktown while those planes were still away, there would be nothing overhead to stop it. Fletcher would have traded his entire offensive punch for a target that might turn out to be a fraction of what he needed to hit. He didn't know how this would end when he gave that order. Neither did anyone else on that bridge. All any of them could do, once the planes were gone and the correction was radioed out behind them, was watch the horizon and wait for a call that would tell them whether the pilots had found anything worth the risk. CT a moment, hold here. If you've ever had to make a call with incomplete information, at work, in your family, anywhere it actually mattered, you already understand what Fletcher was living through on that bridge. Hit like if that feeling's familiar to you. Not for us. For him. By the morning of May 8th, both fleets had finally found what they'd been searching for. Japanese and American scout planes located each other's main carrier groups almost simultaneously. At 8:20, 55 minutes later, both sides launched their strike aircraft into the same patch of open sky. This was the fight the entire operation had been building toward, not a light carrier caught alone in open water. The main event, Shokaku and Zuikaku against Lexington and Yorktown. The full weight of both navies' carrier air power thrown at each other in the same hour. The Japanese strike found the American carriers first. Torpedo bombers came in low against Lexington, catching her with 2 hits that ruptured aviation fuel lines running through the hull. Dive bombers followed, scoring hits on both Lexington and Yorktown. Yorktown survived the day's damage. She would sail on to fight again a month later. Lexington did not. The torpedo hits had done something worse than the visible damage suggested. Aviation gas vapor had seeped into spaces throughout the ship, and hours after the attack ended, hours after the crew believed the worst was over, a spark somewhere below, decks set off an explosion that doomed her. She was abandoned that evening and scuttled by an American destroyer's torpedoes rather than leave her for the enemy to claim. On the Japanese side, Shokaku took 3 bomb hits from American dive bombers. Her flight deck was wrecked badly enough that she could no longer launch or recover aircraft. She turned north, damaged too badly to continue the fight, and began the long voyage home for repairs. Zuikaku escaped the day without a single bomb or torpedo hitting her hull. Aboard Shokaku, the damage told its own story about what this new kind of warfare actually cost. 3 bomb hits tore into her flight deck and hangar spaces, starting fires that her crew fought for hours, buckling steel in ways that no amount of damage control could fix at sea. A carrier without a usable flight deck is, for all practical purposes, no longer a carrier. She can still float. She can still steam. She cannot do the one thing she exists to do. Shokaku turned north that evening, her flight deck a wreck, carrying wounded men and dead men and a crew that had just fought the hardest battle in the ship's short life, bound for a shipyard in Japan and months of repair before she could fight again. By any count of ships sunk or damaged, Japan came out ahead. They lost a light carrier. America lost a fleet carrier, a far more valuable ship. That is the number that made it into the after-action reports. It is not the number that decided what came next. Think about what the men aboard Lexington actually lived through that day. The initial attack looked, for a few hours, like something the ship would recover from. Damage control teams moved through the hull, sealing off flooded compartments, fighting fires, doing the unglamorous work that keeps a wounded ship afloat. Reports went out that Lexington had weathered the worst of it. Sailors who had been at battle stations for hours allowed themselves to believe the danger had passed. Then, in the early afternoon, with no new attack underway, an internal spark ignited fuel vapor that had leaked into spaces throughout the ship from the earlier torpedo hits. The explosion tore through decks that damage control crews had just finished stabilizing. There was no enemy plane overhead when that happened. No new act of combat to point to. Just the slow, invisible consequence of damage already done, catching up with the ship hours after everyone thought the fight was over. Nearly 3,000 men had to be brought off Lexington that evening, transferred to escorting destroyers and cruisers in an evacuation that most of the fleet would remember as orderly, almost calm, despite everything. The great majority of her crew survived. The ship herself did not. She was finished off by torpedoes from an American destroyer once it was clear nothing could save her, because leaving a burning fleet carrier drifting in waters where the enemy might find her again was not an option anyone was willing to accept. It is a strange kind of loss. Not a ship destroyed in the heat of battle. In the moment, everyone is braced for it. But a ship that survives the attack and then is taken by what the attack left behind. Shokaku limped back to Japan for repairs. The damage to her flight deck and hull would keep her out of action for close to 3 months. Zuikaku's hull was untouched, but a carrier is not just steel and deck plating. It is the men who fly off it, and Zuikaku had lost a large share of her air group in the fighting. Pilots and air crews who could not simply be replaced by pulling new men off a training base and handing them the controls. Japan's Naval Command made a decision in the weeks that followed that would only reveal its full weight a month later. Rather than try to combine Shokaku's surviving air crews with Zuikaku's depleted air group, or rush replacement pilots through an accelerated program, the Navy left Zuikaku's air wing as it was. Neither carrier, not the one with the wrecked flight deck, not the one with the gutted air group, sailed with the fleet that Admiral Yamamoto sent toward Midway Island 1 month later. 2 of Japan's 6 fleet carriers, gone from the single most important battle of the Pacific War before it even began. Because of damage and losses absorbed in a fight, most people at the time treated as a draw. Historians would eventually call the Battle of Midway the turning point of the war. 4 Japanese carriers sunk in a single day, a blow the Imperial Navy never fully recovered from. It is worth asking a simple question here. What does a battle actually look like once every ship involved is on the bottom of the ocean, if you only count what happened between the moment the first shot was fired and the moment the last one landed? By that narrow measure, Midway was decided by American dive bombers finding Japanese carriers at the one moment their flight decks were crowded with fueled, armed aircraft. Everyone remembers that moment. Almost nobody remembers that the odds facing those dive bombers were already better than they should have been, because 2 Japanese carriers that could have been there were sitting in a shipyard and a training base instead. Still recovering from a battle a month earlier that most people filed away as a draw, victory rarely announces where it actually started. What almost nobody remembers is that the turning point had a running start. It began a month earlier, in a battle where an admiral who had never flown a plane launched his entire air wing at the wrong target and still managed to cripple part of the force that would have made Midway even harder to win. Yorktown herself carried a piece of this story forward. Damaged at Coral Sea, she limped into Pearl Harbor, needing what engineers estimated would take 3 months to repair. She was patched up and back at sea in 72 hours, in time to take her place at Midway alongside Enterprise and Hornet. 2 Japanese carriers absent. 1 American carrier, battered days earlier, rushed back into the fight anyway. Nobody planned that outcome in advance. Nobody could have. It came from a battle where both admirals were guessing. Both admirals got critical information wrong at least once, and the side that recovered faster from its own mistakes ended up with the advantage that mattered a month later. Consider what Yorktown's repair actually required. Engineers who inspected her at Pearl Harbor after Coral Sea gave an honest estimate, measured in months, not days. That was the professional judgment of men who understood exactly what had been broken and exactly what it would take to fix it the right way. The Pacific Fleet didn't have months. Every carrier it could put to sea for the coming fight mattered, and Yorktown went back into service far sooner than the original estimate ever allowed for. Patched, reinforced, not perfect, but ready enough to take her place in the line again. That's not a footnote to this story. That's the same spirit that put Fletcher on that bridge in the first place. Ordinary people doing what the moment demanded. Faster and rougher than any manual would have called responsible, because the war wasn't going to wait for the tidy version. CTA moment, hold here. If this is the first time you're hearing how much Coral Sea actually shaped what came next at Midway, that's exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell. Subscribe if you want more of the moments that got left out of the textbook version of this war. There is no clean way to end this story with a bow on it. Frank Jack Fletcher did not walk off that bridge with a flawless record. He launched 93 aircraft based on a report that turned out to be wrong. He never got the chance to take that decision back. He found out afterward, the same way every man on that bridge found out, whether the bet had worked. Takeo Takagi never got a clean record out of it either. A submarine officer thrown into command of the most advanced weapon his Navy owned, trusting a report that felt true because it matched what he already believed, and watching 78 aircraft chase a target that barely mattered. Neither man had fought this kind of war before. Neither one had anybody to call who had. That is what I keep coming back to about the men who fought in the Pacific in 1942. Not that they were fearless, not that they always got it right. They were ordinary men, doing jobs nobody had trained them to do, in a form of warfare invented within living memory, making decisions that could not be unmade once they were given. If your father or your grandfather served anywhere in that war, in any uniform, on any ship, I want you to think about what it actually meant to be handed a job like that. Not a job you'd spent your whole life preparing for. A job the moment demanded, whether you were ready or not. They didn't get a manual. They got an order and an ocean, and whatever information happened to reach them in time. Somewhere in this country, right now. There's a photograph in a drawer of a young man standing on the deck of a ship nobody in the family can name. A letter with a censor's black lines through half the sentences. A medal in a box that hasn't been opened in years. Most of those men never talked about what it actually felt like to make a call they couldn't take back, with the fate of a few thousand other men riding on whether they'd guessed right. They didn't come home and describe the fog. They didn't sit at a dinner table and explain what it means to launch everything you have at a target you're no longer sure is real. And then wait. They just went quiet when the war came up, and the family learned, eventually, not to ask. In the comments, tell me if you know a name, a relative, a neighbor, someone from your town, who ended up somewhere in the Pacific doing something he never trained for, and did it anyway. Write down what you remember. Even the small pieces. Even the parts that don't fully make sense to you. Frank Jack Fletcher gave an order a little past 9 in the morning on May 7th, 1942, based on the best information he had, knowing it might already be wrong, with no one above him or beside him who could have told him for certain whether he was right. He wasn't the most experienced man for that job. He wasn't the man anyone would have picked. If the Navy had been given years instead of months to prepare for the kind of war this had become, he was simply the man standing there when the moment arrived, and he made the call anyway, knowing the cost of being wrong and choosing to act regardless. That's not a perfect story. It's an American one, and it happened because an ordinary man chose to act instead of waiting for certainty that was never going to come. The summer of 1945. Southern Okinawa. Inside a cave dug into a hillside, a Japanese soldier named Nomura Seiki takes out a pencil in the dark, and he keeps writing in a diary he is certain no one will ever read. By that summer, the fighting on Okinawa is all but over. His army is gone. The island is lost. Nomura knows it. And still, night after night, he cannot walk out and raise his hands. He hides by day. He crawls out after dark to look for food. And he keeps writing. Not because he thinks anyone will ever read it, but because something in him will not let the record stop. Why? What keeps a man in a war he already knows is over? What does he put on the page when there is no one left to fight for? Nomura's diary survived. And what he wrote in the dark tells us something about the enemy America defeated on Okinawa, and about the men who defeated them, that no after-action report ever could. Before we follow him into that cave, if this is the kind of story that matters to you, the kind that never made it into the history books, take a second and tap that like button. It's how stories like his find the people who still want to hear them. And this is one of those stories. To understand the man in that cave, you first have to understand the ground he was standing on. By the early spring of 1945, the war in the Pacific had come down to a single question. How do you get to Japan itself? The answer lay in a chain of islands stretching south from the home islands. The last stepping stone in that chain was Okinawa. Take Okinawa, and American bombers and warships would sit within easy reach of every Japanese city. The men in Tokyo knew this as well as the men in Washington did. It was the doorstep of the home islands. It was the last door left to kick in. And so the Japanese army made a decision about Okinawa. They would not try to stop the Americans at the water's edge. They had tried that before, on other islands, and they had watched it fail. Naval guns and carrier planes had torn their beach defenses apart before the first American boot ever came ashore. A man standing on a beach with a rifle, waiting for the sea to arrive, was a man already half dead. This time would be different. Just weeks earlier, on another small island called Iwo Jima, the Japanese had shown the Americans a new kind of fight. They had gone underground. They had dug into the rock and the volcanic ash, into tunnels and caves, and they had made the Americans pay for every yard. Iwo Jima was declared secured in the middle of March. It had cost more American blood than almost anyone had imagined. Okinawa would be that same idea, only far, far larger. The Japanese pulled the heart of their defense back into the southern third of the island. There, in the hills around the old Shuri Castle, they turned the earth itself into a weapon. Miles of tunnels, caves linked to caves, gun positions cut into coral ridges, hidden, sighted, waiting. Artillery registered on the roads and the open ground the Americans would have to cross. More than 100,000 men were dug into that ground. Whole villages of Okinawan people were swept up into it as well, pressed into labor, pressed into the line, until it was hard to say where the army ended and the island began. The plan was simple, and it was terrible. Let the Americans land. Let them come inland, and then bleed them, slowly, from inside the rock, for as long as it could possibly be made to last. Not to win. The men who drew up that plan were not fools, and by the spring of 1945, almost none of them still believed in winning. The plan was to make the price so high and the dying so long that the Americans might think twice about the next island, and the one after that, and the invasion of Japan itself that everyone knew was coming. Okinawa was to be a warning written in blood, their own and their enemies'. Every man in that system had a place, a firing position, a stretch of tunnel, a patch of hillside to hold, and if it came to it, a patch of hillside to die on. Their orders were not to survive. Their orders were to last. There is a particular weight to that kind of order. A man told to win can still dream of going home. A man told to last is being told. In words that stop just short of saying it, that home is already behind him. The soldiers who dug those tunnels understood the arithmetic. They were not fools. They knew what 100,000 men with no navy and no air force were being asked to do against the might that was gathering out beyond the horizon. And they dug anyway. They cleaned their rifles anyway. They wrote letters home anyway, and waited. That waiting is the part the movies never show. War, for the ordinary infantryman, is mostly not battle at all. It is the long gray stretch before it. It is the boredom and the discipline and the small routines a man builds to keep himself steady. It is lying in the dark of a cave, listening to the drip of water through coral, thinking of a face 1,000 miles away, and wondering, without ever quite letting the thought finish, whether he will ever see it again. Nomura Seiki was one of those men. He was not a general. He was not an admiral. There is no statue of him anywhere. He wore no medal that history remembers. He was an ordinary infantryman, one small point in a vast machine that had been built for one purpose: to make the taking of that island cost more than the Americans were willing to pay. That is exactly why his story matters. Because when we talk about Okinawa, we talk about the commanders and the fleets and the numbers. We reach for the big words and the wide maps. We almost never hear it from down inside the ground, from a single man with a pencil and a shrinking store of hope. He was in that hillside. He had done the waiting, the digging, the endless gray hours in the dark that make up nearly all of a soldier's war. And he was waiting now for the largest thing any of those men had ever seen to come over the horizon. He would not have to wait much longer. It came on the 1st of April, 1945. By a strange turn of the calendar, it was Easter Sunday. It was also April Fool's Day. The men who waited ashore that morning would remember both of those things in the years afterward, with a kind of grim wonder. What gathered off Okinawa that morning had never been seen before in the history of the world. More than 1,300 ships stood off that island. Battleships whose guns could throw a shell the weight of a small car. Carriers with their decks crowded with aircraft. Cruisers and destroyers past counting. Transports packed to the rails with soldiers and Marines. Landing craft in numbers no man on that shore could take in with a single look. Behind them came the supply ships, the repair ships, the hospital ships, a floating city that had crossed an entire ocean to arrive at this one shore. In the weeks that followed, the count of vessels drawn into the operation would climb past 1,600. It was the largest amphibious force ever assembled. It has never been matched since. It never will be. Stop and hold that picture for a moment. Because there is a comparison here that tells the whole story of the war, without a single word of explanation. 3.5 years earlier, at Pearl Harbor, Japan had struck the United States with the finest striking force in the world. 6 aircraft carriers. 6. That was the spear point of an empire. That was the blow that was supposed to break American will in a single morning and win the war before it truly began. 6 carriers at Pearl Harbor in 1941. And now, off one island in the spring of 1945, the Americans had gathered a fleet so large a man standing on the shore could look out to sea and not find the horizon. Only ships. All the way out to where the sky came down to meet the water. That is what a little under 4 years of war had done. That is the distance between the two nations, measured not in speeches, but in steel. One side had spent itself down to almost nothing. Its great carriers on the bottom of the sea, its pilots dead, its factories starved of oil and iron. The other had been struck a terrible blow on a Sunday morning, and had answered it by building and building and building, until it could wrap a wall of ships around an island on the far side of the earth, and never feel the strain. And here is the part worth pausing on, because it is the part that belongs to the people watching this. That wall of ships did not come from nowhere. It was not conjured by admirals or presidents. Every hull out there had been laid down by someone, welded by a man on a scaffold in Baltimore, or a woman on a night shift in a yard on the Gulf. Someone's wife or mother or daughter, learning a trade the country had never before asked of her. Every shell in every magazine had been packed by hands back home. Every plane on every carrier deck had rolled out of a plant in a town most of those sailors had never heard of. A free country, struck hard on a Sunday morning, had turned to its own ordinary people and asked them to build the answer. And they had. That fleet off Okinawa was not just a weapon. It was a whole nation's grit, floated across an ocean and set down off the enemy's last doorstep. When we talk about who won that war, We are talking about them too. The ones who never fired a shot, and who built the thing that ended it. Before the landing came the bombardment. The Americans called it, among themselves, a typhoon of steel. For days the battleships and cruisers stood off the coast and worked the island over, shell after shell, until the ground itself seemed to come apart. From out at sea it looked as though nothing could live under it. But the men who had drawn up the Japanese plan had counted on exactly this. Deep in their tunnels, down under yards of coral and earth, the defenders waited it out. The typhoon of steel passed over the top of them and barely touched the heart of the defense. When it lifted, the men were still there, still in their firing positions, still waiting. That was the whole point of going underground. You cannot bombard what you cannot reach. And then something happened on that shore that the American veterans would talk about for the rest of their lives. Nothing. The landing craft dropped their ramps. The Marines and soldiers came down into the surf, braced for the storm of fire they had learned to expect on every other beach in the Pacific. Tarawa had been a slaughter at the waterline. Peleliu had been a nightmare. Iwo Jima had been worse. Every man who splashed ashore that morning was ready to die in the first 100 yards, because on every other island, that is where men had died. And instead, they walked. They walked up the beach, standing upright. They crossed the sand without a shot fired at them. They moved inland, took an airfield that was supposed to cost them dearly, and kept going, and still nothing came. It was so strange, so unnatural to men who had seen the other beaches, that it frightened them more than gunfire would have. A quiet beach in the Pacific was not a mercy. It was a question with no good answer. Where were they? What were they waiting for? Something was wrong. It was too quiet. The commander of the American fleet, Admiral Raymond Spruance, sent a message to Admiral Nimitz that caught the mood exactly. He said, in so many words, that he might be crazy, but it looked as though the Japanese had quit the war, at least in this sector. Nimitz sent back a reply that men still smile about. Delete everything, he said, after the word crazy. But the Japanese had not quit, not even close. The silence on that beach was not surrender. It was patience. It was the plan working exactly as designed. The Americans had been allowed to come ashore, allowed to walk inland, allowed to feel that strange and hopeful quiet, because the men who were going to kill them were waiting. Underground, in the hills to the south. The dying had not been cancelled. It had only been postponed and moved inland to ground of the enemy's choosing. Men like Nomura were down in that ground while the greatest fleet in history unloaded onto their island. From where they stood, the thing bearing down on them was not simply an army. It was the entire output of a continent. It was every factory in Detroit, every shipyard on 2 coasts, every ton of steel a free country could pour into the water. And it was coming for the hills. The Japanese did strike back, but their answer told the same story as everything else. With their fleet gone and their airfields shattered, they reached for the only weapon they had left in numbers: young men. Aircraft loaded with fuel and explosives and pointed at the American ships, never meant to come home, off Okinawa. The kamikaze came in the largest numbers of the entire war. Wave after wave, they came at the destroyers standing picket duty, out on the edge of the fleet, and they came at the great ships behind them. They sank vessels and damaged many more, and they killed American sailors by the thousands. Before it was over, something close to 1 in every 7 American naval deaths in the whole of the Second World War would happen in those 2 months, off that one island. The sea around Okinawa became the most dangerous water the United States Navy had ever sailed. There was one last gesture, and it belongs in this story because of what it was. The Japanese sent out the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, the pride of the Imperial Navy, on a one-way run toward Okinawa. She carried barely enough fuel to get there. There was no plan to bring her back. She was meant to reach the island, run herself aground, and fight as a steel fortress to the end. She never got close. American carrier planes found her at sea and overwhelmed her, and most of the ships with her, before she came within 200 miles of the island. The greatest warship in the world, thrown against a cause already lost, went to the bottom for nothing. Remember that. The last great gesture of the Empire, spent for nothing, because a hopeless gesture was the only thing left to offer. We will come back to it, because down in the caves, a man with a pencil was thinking his way toward the very same truth. For a while, the plan held. The fighting in the South became some of the worst of the entire war. The spring rains came and turned the hills to mud, and the mud, churned by shell fire, and worse, turned into something no man who was there could ever fully describe to anyone who wasn't. Men fought and died for ridges whose names meant nothing to anyone back home, and everything to the men bleeding on them. Sugarloaf, Half Moon, Horseshoe. Little scraps of high ground bought and paid for over and over in the same currency. The Americans paid, too, at every level. Even the general commanding the American ground forces was killed by a Japanese shell near the front before the island fell. No one on either side was buying that island cheap. But a plan built on holding out can only end one way, when the other side will not stop coming. Through May and into June, the Japanese line was ground down, pushed back, broken apart. The great tunnel network around Shuri was abandoned. The defense, once a single terrible machine, came apart into pieces. Small groups of men, then smaller ones, scattered across the broken southern tip of the island, pressed back toward the sea, with nowhere left to go. By the third week of June, organized resistance had collapsed. The commanding general was gone, and with him, the last thread of order. What had been an army was now something else. Fragments, survivors, men cut off from any order, any supply, any hope of rescue. Nomura was one of those survivors. The machine he had been part of was gone. The chain of command that had put him in that hillside no longer existed. There were no more orders coming. There was no line to hold. There was no plan anymore, terrible or otherwise. There was only the ground, and the enemy on top of it, and the problem of staying alive from 1 hour to the next. And so his war became very small, and very hard. By day he stayed in the caves. It was the only safety left. The same rock that had been dug as a fortress was now a hiding place. He waited out the daylight in the dark, in the damp, in the close and rotten air, in the smell of too many men in too little space, with no way to keep clean, and not enough to eat. By night he came out to look for food. Think about what that means. Stripped of all the grand language of battles and campaigns. A grown man, a soldier of a great empire, reduced to crawling out in the dark to find something to put in his stomach. Searching the ruined fields, picking through what the fighting had left behind, moving low and quiet past the places where the Americans now camped, close enough to hear their voices, their music, the ordinary sounds of men who had won and knew it. Listening, freezing at every noise, then slipping back underground before the light could find him and give him away. The caves themselves were their own kind of hell by then. What had been dug as a fortress had become a warren of the desperate. In the deeper positions, there were the wounded, who could not be moved and could not be treated. And there were men who had simply stopped, sitting in the dark, past the point where hope or fear could reach them. There were civilians, too. Okinawan families who had fled the shelling into the same rock. caught between an army that would not surrender and an enemy they had been taught to dread. The air was foul with all of it. A man learned to breathe through his mouth and not to look too closely at the shapes along the walls. The Americans sent teams out to find men like him, to call them out of the caves in their own language and in Japanese, to coax them into surrendering, to bring them in, to end the hiding one hole in the ground at a time. It was dangerous, patient work, and it went on long after the outcome was decided. Nomura and the men with him learned to evade those teams, to read the ground, to stay just out of reach, to keep the small, exhausting machinery of survival running for one more day. And then one more, and then one more after that. And it went on. That is the thing hardest to hold in the mind from a safe distance, not a night of it, or a week. The organized battle for Okinawa alone had ground on for nearly 3 months, and for men like Nomura, the ordeal did not end when the battle did. The hiding stretched on past the fall of the island, past the surrender, into a summer that would not end. Some men on those islands stayed lost in the rock for weeks, a few elsewhere in the Pacific, held out for years, unable to believe or unwilling to accept that the thing they had given everything to was finished. Time itself became an enemy. Each day survived was not a day closer to anything. It was simply one more day held against the dark. There is no glory in any of this. That is worth saying plainly. The war Nomura was fighting by that point had no banners in it, no charges, no last stands worthy of a song. It was hunger and dirt and fear and the animal work of not being found. Whatever grand ideas had once been poured into these men had boiled away, and what was left was the oldest thing there is, a living creature trying to see the next sunrise, and a pencil. And through all of it, he kept the diary. That is the detail that stops you when you sit with this story long enough. A man in his situation had every reason to give it up. The paper was one more thing to carry and to hide. The writing was one more risk, one more minute spent on something that could not feed him or defend him. There was no reader waiting. There was no one to hand it to. By every practical measure, the diary was pointless. He kept writing anyway. He wrote in the dark, in a cave, on an island his side had already lost, for no one at all, as if the act of setting it down was the last thing left that was still his to decide, as if a man who had lost his army, his cause, his future, and every certainty he had ever marched under could still choose to be the one who wrote it down. There is a kind of stubbornness in that which has nothing to do with any flag. It is simply a man refusing to disappear without a trace. And then the war ended. On the 15th of August, 1945, Japan surrendered. On the far side of the world, in cities Nomura would never see, the guns went quiet, and the church bells rang, and people wept in the streets, and strangers embraced. The most destructive war in human history was over. But news like that does not reach a man in a cave. There was no one to tell him, no radio in the dark, no officer to gather the survivors and read out the words, because there were no officers left, and no order left to give. The empire he had fought for had laid down its arms, and he did not know, or could not be sure, or could not bring himself to believe it. For men in his position, the war did not end on a date. It frayed away slowly, in confusion and rumor, long after the rest of the world had moved on, and even if a whisper of it had reached him, a shouted word from a pacification team, a rumor passed between men in the dark. How was he to believe it? Every instinct his war had trained into him said it was a trick. The enemy wanted him to come out. Of course, the enemy would say the war was over. Men had been killed walking toward voices that promised safety. In that world, the truth and the trap sounded exactly alike, and a man who guessed wrong did not get to guess again. This was not new for the ordinary Japanese soldier or civilian. All through the war, they had lived in a kind of engineered darkness. The press told them of victories that were really defeats. There was even a special word that came into use, a gentle, poetic word that meant a jewel shattering, used to dress up the complete destruction of a Japanese garrison so that the truth could be spoken without being spoken. When a whole island of men was wiped out, the people at home were told the jewel had shattered. Beautiful language laid over a mass grave. That was the information a man like Nomura had lived inside for years. So when the greatest news of all finally came, there was no reason he would simply hear it and believe. We know something about his mind in those final days, because he wrote it down. There is an entry in his diary dated the 10th of August, in the last hours of the war, with the world he knew already collapsing around him, and the surrender only days away. And what he wrote is not what you might expect from a soldier of that army. He wrote about the men who had died, shouting, "Long live the Emperor," charging to their deaths with the Emperor's name on their lips. And he confessed, plainly, to the page, how empty it all seemed to him, how futile. He wrote that he could never do such a thing himself. The Emperor, he wrote, was too distant, a figure who had nothing to do with him, with his life, with the things he actually cared about. He could not make himself feel the thing he was supposed to feel. He could not shout that word and throw his life away for that man. So what had he been fighting for? Through all of it? Through the tunnels and the shelling and the mud and the hunger? Not the Emperor. He said so himself, in his own hand, when he had no reason left to lie and no one to lie to. He had fought for the homeland, for the ordinary, familiar people who lived there, his parents, his brothers and sisters, his relatives, his friends, for the country of his ancestors, for the near and human things a man can actually hold in his mind and his heart. And then he wrote the line that changes everything. He believed he was not alone in this. He believed that most of the other soldiers, underneath all the slogans, felt exactly the same way that he did. Sit with that for a moment. Everything we are taught about that army points the other way. We picture fanatics, men in love with death, men who could not wait to throw their lives away for a god emperor. And there certainly were men like that, and children trained to be like that, and the war was full of them, and they were terrible to face. But here, in the dark, at the very end, an ordinary infantryman set down a very different truth. He saw the banzai charges for what they were. He thought they were a waste. He was, in his own quiet way, indifferent to the emperor. The whole vast system had been built to worship. And afterward, when the war was studied and soldiers were asked, it turned out he had been right about his comrades. A great many of them had felt the same distance, the same private indifference. Behind the slogans they were made to shout, "Remember the Yamato, the greatest battleship in the world, sent on a one-way run with barely the fuel to arrive, thrown at the island with no way home. She had gone to the bottom for nothing, a magnificent gesture wrapped around an empty center, spent because the grand empty gesture had become the only thing the Empire still knew how to ask. From his cave, Nomura had reached the same conclusion the ship never could. He looked at the men charging to their deaths with the Emperor's name in their mouths, and where the propaganda saw glory, he saw only waste. He had watched the logic that sent the Yamato out, and he had quietly refused it. He would not spend himself for nothing. not for a slogan, not for a distant throne. And yet, and this is the knot at the center of the whole story, still he had fought, and fought hard, and was still out there in the rock, refusing to give up, not out of madness, and not out of love for a distant god on a throne, but out of something far more familiar: home, family. The people whose faces he could actually picture when he closed his eyes. I have read more of these diaries than I can count, and the ones that stay with you are never the ones full of hate. They are the ones where an ordinary man, with no reason left to lie, simply writes down what he sees. That is the man in the cave. Not a monster, not a zealot. A son and a brother, who had already decided the dying for the emperor business was hollow, and who could still not make himself walk out into the daylight, put up his hands, and be done with it. And that is the thing that ought to make us stop and think hardest of all. Now widen the lens, and hold Nomura in the corner of your eye while you do it. The men who planned the war looked at Okinawa and did not see a victory to celebrate. They saw a warning of what still lay ahead, because Okinawa was not Japan. It was one island, out on the edge, and it had cost nearly 3 months, and blood past counting, and a toll on the American Navy so heavy that something close to 1 in 7 of all its wartime dead had fallen in that single stretch of water. If one edge island fought like that, the planners asked, what would the home islands be? The answer they came back with was staggering. An invasion of Japan itself would mean millions of men committed, and casualty estimates so high that the men doing the counting flinched from their own numbers. And waiting on those home islands were not just soldiers. There were civilians being drilled with sharpened bamboo. Children, like the schoolgirl who wrote in her own diary that she had learned even one person could kill many of the enemy. A whole nation being shaped into one great version of that southern hillside on Okinawa. Now take the man in the cave, the one who saw the futility, who did not love the emperor, who wanted to live and still would not stop, and multiply him by millions. That was the shadow hanging over every decision made in the summer of 1945. That was the thing the men in Washington were staring into when they made the hardest choice of the war. The stubbornness of one ordinary soldier in one cave, written across an entire country. Understand Nomura, and you understand why the war ended the way it did, and why the men who ended it believed, to their graves, that they had spared the world something far worse. For too long, the story of the Pacific has been told as a fight against fanatics, against an enemy so alien, so strange, so eager to die, that beating him was almost a matter of clearing away something less than human. It is a comforting story. It makes the victory simple. It makes the enemy a wave of screaming ghosts, and so it quietly makes beating him less of a thing than it truly was. But Nomura's diary will not let us keep that comfort. The enemy America defeated on Okinawa was not a cartoon. He was a man who could see the futility of the slogans as clearly as any of us can. A man who wanted to live. A man who fought not for a god, but for his mother and his home. The very same things the American boys coming up those ridges were fighting for. And knowing all of that, feeling all of that, he still would not stop. He hid, and he starved, and he crawled through the dark. And he kept going long after the cause was lost, and the empire had surrendered, and there was nothing left to gain. That is who the American fighting man had to overcome. Not a mob of madmen in love with death, easily swept aside. A nation of ordinary men who did not want to die, who could not be reasoned or frightened out of it, who had to be beaten from the beaches to the ridges to the last caves in the coral, 1 yard and 1 hole in the ground at a time. Understand that, and you understand what the victory actually cost. You understand why the men who won it came home the way so many of them did. Quiet, mostly, and slow to say much about what they had seen out there. They had not brushed aside a horde of fanatics. They had gone up against an enemy with real depth and real endurance, an enemy who fought for love of home just as they did, and they had beaten him anyway, all the way down to the last man in the last cave. That is not a smaller achievement than the legend. It is a far greater one. You do not measure a victory by how weak your enemy was. You measure it by how much he had in him, and by the fact that you prevailed regardless. The man in the cave lived. Nomura survived the war he had already lost, came out of the dark at last, and carried his diary out with him into a world that had changed beyond all recognition. It is the only reason we can read his words at all. The only reason a soldier no history book would ever have named still has a voice, 80 years on. Think of how nearly it went the other way. A few sheets of paper, carried through fire and starvation, out of a cave, across the wreckage of a lost war, and somehow not lost, somehow found, somehow kept, somehow set into English by a scholar half a world away and half a lifetime later. It should not have survived. Almost none of them did. For every diary that reached us, thousands of ordinary men on both sides took what they saw and felt and knew straight into the ground with them. And it is gone, and it is not coming back. And that brings me to the last thing I want to say to you. Maybe you had a father, or a grandfather, who was out there, on a ship off Okinawa, in that deadly water, on a beach somewhere in the Pacific he never talked much about, if he talked about it at all. Maybe you heard just a piece of it once, at the dinner table, a name, a place, a half-finished sentence, the kind of story that never made it into any book. Those stories are leaving us now, one by one, as that generation goes. If you are holding one, tell it. Leave it in the comments below. A name, a place, a thing he said, or a thing he never could. Because once it is gone, no historian can bring it back. Your father's war deserves to be remembered too.